Until the last decade of the 15th century, the islands at the edge of the world were as far west as it was believed human beings could travel without falling over the edge. The leader of the Western world, the United States, had not even been discovered.
So far in this series, we've employed the expression East and West. This is common today and is often used in the context of East versus West, whether the East be China or Iran or North Korea. There has been a kind of text, variously subliminal and frequently overt, in the West since the Renaissance, that European, Western culture was superior to Eastern culture. This gained purchase in the 19th century as the Muslim Turkish or Ottoman Empire, whose capital was Istanbul, faltered in the Balkans, the Near and Middle East. And as scholars like Jacob Burckhardt, Thomas Carlyle, François Guizot enjoyed the acclaim of readers of their best-selling books on the march of Western culture and values. Indeed, Istanbul was marked in 19th century atlases as Constantinople, its former Christian name. A sense of Western superiority was likewise engendered by the developments in agriculture and industry in Europe from the late 17th century, although it has since been calculated that in 1800 Chinese manufacturing output was greater than the rest of the world put together. By the 19th century and for much of the 20th, perhaps the most significant spur to the sense of European complacency was imperialism. The islands at the edge of the world, more than any other Western state, had an empire that spanned the world. Imperialism exported European authority and ideas, Christian ideas most of all, to the world. The first Europeans to sail the Atlantic arrived in 1492 at the island of Hispaniola, now divided between the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The three ships that made this voyage were under the command of Christopher Columbus, who was born in Genoa, Italy. Sharing the Iberian Peninsula with the Spanish were the Portuguese, who'd sailed round the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of southern Africa as far as India by the 1480s. The Portuguese had a ruler at this time whose epithet is just. He was Henry the Navigator. His principal adventurer, the first European to see Table Mountain, was Vasco da Gama. The Portuguese soon joined the Spanish in America, where these two Iberian monarchies conquered most of the central and southern continent in the 16th century, carving out and ruthlessly exploiting valuable empires. And these avowedly Christian rulers supplemented the growing labor shortage in their new American territories by the importation of slaves from Africa, the slave trade becoming a valuable business in itself. Dutch, French and British followed the North Atlantic route from the 17th century, subduing the indigenous peoples of the modern United States and Canada. Christian Tsars conquered more than 2 million square miles of Asia, continuing a policy inaugurated by Ivan IV, the Terrible, in the 16th century, picked up again in the 18th century by Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, who conquered her way south to the Crimea and the Black Sea. By 1900, there were few areas of the world that were not part of some European empire or European successor state like the United States. Even the Germans and the Belgians joined in the scramble for Africa in the closing years of the 19th century, the King of the Belgians owning as his private property the richest plum of them all, the Congo, covering 1.5 million square miles. By the end of the Great War in 1918, the Empire of China had been dissolved, and the new republic was at civil war that would not end until 1949. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had consolidated most of the Tsarist empire to become the Soviet empire of Marshal Stalin in the 1930s. The last non-Western empire, Turkey, was reduced to Asia Minor, the British and the French hacking off Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq for themselves. The few remaining independent states, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Iran, Afghanistan, Thailand, fell into some Western powers' sphere of influence. Latin America had become the backyard of the United States, whose governments propped up puppet dictatorships in the last century. The only Eastern country to survive and prosper was the Empire of Japan, but I use Eastern here rather more in a geographical sense. It does not fit into my conception of the East and the West, whose last unquestioned cultural triumph in Britain was probably Sir Kenneth Clarke's television series Civilization in the early 1970s. That preamble is well outside our period, but if we are to understand anything about our present, we need to have a sense of the strands that reach down to us from the past. The islands at the edge of the world in the so-called Dark Ages were part of a much larger world, and these old links have only fairly recently received more recognition, especially from people like Melvyn, Bragg and Andrew Marr on BBC Radio 4. The impetus for a cultural and militarist war against the East was initiated in 1095 by a resurgent papacy under Pope Urban II of Clermont-Ferrand, France, who decreed holy war against Muslims in Palestine. This was the First Crusade, and you might see in the 2003 attack on Iraq that Western zeal had hardly diminished since Pope Urban. It has been rightly said that societies are not made, they grow of their own accord. Politicians seem to have forgotten this since the beginning of the last century, if ever they knew it. The proposition of East versus West goes back at least 2,500 years and is attributed to the father of history, the Greek writer Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC. He was probably born in Halicarnassus, now Bodrum in southwest Turkey, in about 484 BC, which was then part of the Persian Empire. From now on, we shall call Iran by its common historical name of Persia. He travelled through much of the Persian Empire, through Asia Minor to Syria, to Mesopotamia with its great city of Babylon, described in the Old Testament book of Daniel, as far as Susa, the ancient Persian capital. He visited Egypt, which, as today, still stuns foreign visitors, and he reached Aswan in the south. The pharaohs had been conquered by King Cambyses of Persia in the late 500s BC. Much of Book 2 and all of his third book of his 9-book history are devoted to this fabulous land. He went to Thrace and Macedonia, also Persian possessions, and round the north coast of the Black Sea where there were Greek outposts. He seems to have lived in or near Athens on at least 2 occasions, but probably had his home in Thurii, a Greek town in southern Italy. His history was published very soon after his death at Thurii in about 425 BC. It's not known when he undertook his journeys, but they would have taken years. Why he made his travels, wrote his history, it is vastly more than a travelogue, and structured it is unknown. That he was inquisitive, courageous, and a great observer cannot be doubted. He narrates the Greek-Persian 30-year war from 499 BC that includes the famous battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. He is interested to know how a king of Persia could weld together as one and command Medes, Persians, and other races in fleets and armies that may have numbered 1 million troops, more than 10 times the complement of the British Army today. He tells us of King Xerxes' rages, one of which was about the Hellespont, a stretch of water in the North Aegean. This was so rough that it delayed his army reaching land across a bridge of boats, and the king sentenced the water to 300 strokes of the lash, which punishment was carried out with great formality. He also tells us how Xerxes watched from a throne on top of a hill as his fleet was defeated at Salamis. On another occasion, how the Persian ruler wept about the brevity of life as his men went into battle. To Herodotus, it seems almost miraculous that the Greeks won against such organised aggression. They fought as individual city-states or as kings, and pulled through because of the mistakes made by their enemies, not perhaps unlike the capture of Troy as told by Homer in the Iliad. In this heroic poem, the Greek leaders are constantly arguing among themselves, but prevail after 10 years because of a clever ruse, the Trojan Horse. The excellent Professor Bettany Hughes has recently proposed that the Iliad can, in fact, be interpreted as an anti-war poem, which makes it vastly more interesting to read. His travels into Persia may have been a quest to understand the difference between the disjunctive Greeks and the organised Persian Empire, the East and the West. He describes the politics of the Greek leaders who took part in the war against the Persians. Essentially, this boiled down to democratic Athens and authoritarian Sparta. Athenian democracy was a very limited affair, in which all women and most men had no role at all. Interestingly, Spartan women could own their own property, and at around this time it is estimated 40% of Spartan land was held by women. No surprise then that Herodotus was accused by Athenians as the father of lies. For Herodotus, perhaps this Greek-Persian war was about the absolutist Persian East, in which the merest whim of a king was obeyed, and the Greek West was about some sense of popular law. For despite occasional dictators like Draco, they were elected and they could be got rid of. A nugget. Draco drew up a law code that was so severe it has entered modern English in the adjective draconian. Herodotus is uniquely devoid of racial prejudice. He is perceptive, critical, and has a profound feel for human nature. At about the same time that Herodotus was writing, what are now known as the Elgin marbles, 92 sculptures once painted, were installed in the frieze of the Parthenon at Athens. They depict the Greek war of survival against the Persians, and also the wars between Athens and Sparta. The Persians are represented as wild creatures, some as centaurs, half man, half horse. The marbles are the first plastic representation of the East-West fight to the death of the day. The Greeks, under a king of Macedonia, would break out of their small territory about a century after Herodotus and overthrow the Persian Empire. That great adventure would be led by Alexander the Great, who carried Greek culture far and wide, and whose successors would make permanent the foundation of Western or Greek philosophy, literature, jurisprudence, science, geometry, medicine, etc., first and importantly in the Roman Empire itself. Herodotus has been in print almost from the inception of printing in Germany in the 15th century. He is in paperback, and you don't have to be a scholar to read and enjoy him in English.
While the East, under Byzantine emperors and Baghdad caliphs, developed Greek-Roman culture, the West laboured under the obscurantism of the Roman Church. We shall begin to see why in the next episode.